We've been doing a story. There's a lot of support from the Ukraine finance minister in the UK of taking the £18 billion pounds of funds of Russian oligarchs and putting it as war risk insurance with World Bank, MIGA, EBRD, and USDFC. And that can be used now for private sector investment in Ukraine.
I haven't focused on, there are legal issues related to the oligarchs that make them more complicated. And there you do get into property rights and others. So I don't know. I'm not against it. I'm just saying I focused on the bigger amounts for the official.
But that's a big problem because the private sector can't get in because the political risk doesn't really cover the war insurance, and that's the excuse.
No.
And that, as you said, Western Ukraine.
I think you just need to separate. I agree about risk insurance.
Yeah.
Where you get the funding from is a separate question.
Yeah. I mean, the oligarchs. It's a debate whether they're even going to keep their assets after the war, but that's the thing.
And I'm not saying no. I'm saying that the easier one is the official assets,
rather than the private assets. I mean, you're taking it's big, but it's an escrow. So why keep an escrow? Put it into something that can be used.
That's what we're saying.
But you can use that from the frozen, put it into war risk.
I just don't know. I'm just saying I don't. I just things that I know and things that I don't know.
All right, because you were at MIGA and EBRD, and I don't think Mr. Larry Summers had ever worked in that micro level before.
Yeah,
I mean, he's a hedge fund. D. Shaw was making.
No, but I don't know. You mentioned the British. I just don't know the legal status of the oligarchs.
But we can do it under U.S. law, right?
I don't know.
Just take
that you may run into due process claims.
Because DFC, in theory, can, because it's only funded by the U.S. government, can already put in the war. It already has the ability to issue the war risk insurance as the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, like your former OPEC, because the first person who ever made, if I'm right, who ever used war risk insurance was the United States in like 1914 or whatever, right?
Yeah,
so it's U.S.
insurance is fine, but I'm just saying that I don't
taking their assets and. Okay. All right.
So you can maybe pick up the things that you like and sort of ignore the things you don't like. So I would be pushing the Chinese also to recognize that they're out of line on this with Moscow. They're not going to abandon Putin. But what about if they're willing to support Ukraine a little bit, starting out with humanitarian, maybe be involved in the reconstruction? You get a lot of people screaming, oh, no, we don't want China in there. If you really want to sustain Ukraine and put China in a position where someday it may push Putin a little bit, why not have them be involved in the process? It goes to Larry's point is, in the midst of war, it's easy to kind of take the moral judgment and say, look, we have to keep them out of it. If you want to look towards a long-term victory, you want to get everybody to accept the idea of a Ukrainian democracy linked to Europe, successful economy.
So I want to bring in our colleague.
Susan, I think you're
Yeah.
I think you're hearing from. You're certainly hearing from me, and I think you're hearing from my fellow panelists here something very important, which is the greater scope for effective policy from here is overwhelmingly on the side of using economics to help Ukraine, rather than using economics to punish Russia. Towards the beginning of World War II, the Marshall Plan happened several years after World War II, as did the actual formation of the international institutions. I think it's naive to think that you can rebuild the Ukrainian infrastructure in the middle of the war. I don't think it's naive to believe that you can provide a continuous flow of resources on which the Ukrainian budget can rely during the war. I've been through a lot of these things. The lags are very, very long. Now is the time to begin a process of detailed planning for Ukrainian reconstruction. But I agree with you that putting in place large-scale capital goods is probably not feasible in this context. I think it's also important here to record one sober note that I think is very important for everyone to be aware of as they think about this set of issues. To be blunt, Ukrainian economic performance from 1989 to 2014 was dismal, even by the standards of the countries that had been liberated by the end of the Cold War, with corruption not being a small part of the problem. And so I think that we all agree on the absolute centrality, by the way, for avoiding a third Russian invasion of Ukraine's economic success. We all agree, I think, on the centrality of Europe, of Ukraine coming together with Europe so as to be maximally strong in association with, ultimately as a member of, the European Union. But I think it is very important that we not suppose that the Ukrainian economic issue is only or is even primarily just a matter of mobilizing resources. There's a lot else that needs to be recognized here.
Can I add?
Yeah.
To go to your question about the preparation, there's been some very good work done by the Center for European Policy Reform, which is sort of a transatlantic group of luminaries kind of looking at this issue. The World Bank and others have, EBRD, have started to look at these issues. But I think it's important for this purpose is to divide this into three different parts. One, as Larry and I have said, there's survival. There's $3 to $5 billion a month separate from the military, just so you can pay salaries and make sure that you don't have an inflationary spiral and so on. Second, there's an important phrase of what I refer to as the recovery, which is not rebuilding all the infrastructure they're going to destroy. But one of the things, there are parts of Western Ukraine that are safer to make it easier for people to come back, and schools and basic sort of shelter situation, so as to give the resilience of Ukraine and its people. And then the third is the longer term sort of reconstruction. On the longer term part, but this again goes to sort of Larry's sort of strategic outlook here, I think it's also important that the G7 and the G20 and other supporters start to think about how would they structure that to deal with some of the problems of corruption and oligarchs and others. And one possibility, what the Marshall Plan did, was it set up an agency that actually went out of business. Okay? And one of the few times this happens in governmental times. And I think people are going to have to think about this because Europe obviously has got the primary interest, and as Larry said, the strategic goal is to bring them into the European Union. That's just like bringing Weimar into the international economy. That's got to be the guiding star. But I think people will be uncomfortable if it's just sort of a sub-piece of the European Commission and will be bureaucratically brought down. So one possibility would be to create something that has a key European dimension. The World Bank, Larry did this, the chief economist, I was there as president, would often coordinate these activities. They're called consultative groups, so that you sort of made sure that people weren't stepping all over each other. There are different ways you can structure this, but I think the important part, again, the way you started it is, okay, we need the military action, we need the equipment, but it's time to be thinking about the resources and structure of short-term recovery, reconstruction. And by the way, that also sends a message to Putin. It sends a message to Putin that he's dealing with the G7 economies, for God's sakes. I mean, do you really think he's going to overcome them on the economic issue?
I'm glad you brought Putin back up. We're about to get to questions from the audience, and we're
the allocations made both for refugees and for victims through high food and energy prices of this conflict. And I think in addition to being right morally, that is also attractive as a strategy of building global support here.
So before, Phil, we jump into the question of how we should spend it, what, aside from World War I, in your view, are there